The Little Black Dog by Witch. When I was around 10 years old, I had a horrific encounter that I have not been able to shake off. My family and I were on a flight over to Arizona. The flight over from Australia was long and tiring. When we finally landed, we collected our luggage and took a shuttle over to the campsite that we would be staying at. We arrived and set up our tents, but I demanded that I have a tent with my older sister. So she and I set up our tents and got ready for the night. After setting everything up and after a very long flight, everyone was quickly exhausted. Even so, we stayed up long enough to make some s'mores in front of the campfire with a local ranger who stopped by. Now, this ranger had a black dog named Ziggy. As we were chatting, I could hardly keep my eyes open, so my mom thought it would be best if we all got some sleep. Before we went off the bed, I asked the ranger if he wouldn't mind if I had his dog sleep with us in our tent. He didn't mind, but he did ask me to return him the next morning. Everyone had fallen asleep, and I was awake with Ziggy lying at my feet. All of a sudden, Ziggy rose to attention, and he slowly began to creep toward the door. When I saw this, I could feel my heart pounding faster. I hadn't shut the tent properly last night, and it was unzipped at the bottom. Ziggy puts his head through to the outside, and I rush over to my sister and shake her awake. I point to the tent. My sister holds her finger to her mouth, making sure that I don't say a word. She slowly advances toward Ziggy when he jumps back whimpering quietly. My sister jumps forward and zips the tent shut, then grabs her phone and turns on the flashlight. That's when the scratching started. It was coming from just outside the tent. It started up the back and was just barely quiet. Then it seemed to advance, getting louder and faster as it came closer to the zipper. Ziggy growled and backed into the corner. My sister and I shuffled back as well, just watching. I whispered to my sister, "Shouldn't we call our mom?" And she shook her head. But then, the most horrifying thing happened. "Shouldn't we call our mom?" Someone repeated exactly what I said, and the voice came right outside the tent entrance. They had imitated me the moment that I had said something, but the voice was distorted, as if its vocal cords had been fried. I'd never been so scared before. I did not know what to do. It was like we were cornered in that tent. We had nowhere to go, well, except toward the thing that had just mimicked me. We waited for several minutes that slowly dragged by. My sister then crawled over to the entrance and slowly unzipped the tent door. Then she looked outside. I came up next to her and poked an eye out through the small hole. We saw what we thought looked exactly like Ziggy, but after a moment, we saw that it just wasn't right. His back was sort of caved in, and the hind legs were longer, and the body was wet and soaked. Then the thing that looked like Ziggy leered at us, straight in the eye. I shut my eyes fast and encouraged my sister to do so as well, and then I said to her that maybe we should scream to try to scare it off. So the two of us together screamed as loud as we could, and so highly pitched that Ziggy began to bark. I opened one eye and saw that the thing was running away now. My mom came rushing out and saw both of us screaming and crying. We told her everything and could not get back to sleep after that. The next morning, we saw the ranger and told him about our story. He told us that it sounded like a skinwalker. My mom, a bit irritated that he was trying to scare us, demanded that we leave early. So we did. We ended up staying at a cheap motel, and then we flew back home shortly after. 9 years later, I've never been the same. Consider this next story a bonus story. It's not really the same as the other camping stories in this episode, but it does feature two campers of sorts taking care of an elderly lady. It's disgusting and disturbing, and I thought you would definitely love to hear it. The Ants of Rot by Ikmik L. When I was 6 years old, my parents broke up and divorced. My dad moved a few miles away to a large apartment building. This story took place around 3 years after he moved in. I would go to visit him on Wednesdays and every other weekend. Every time I would visit, there would be a person camping outside of one of the apartment buildings. When I say camping, I mean that the person, sometimes a man and sometimes a woman, would be sitting in a fold-up chair with their phone plugged into a socket along the corridor. I later learned that they were caretakers of a very elderly lady who did not like them inside her house, so she made them set up camp outside. One day in December, right before Christmas break, we started noticing a slightly strange odor looming around that corridor. We didn't pay much mind to this, as we had packing to do for the trip. As I recall, on the evening that we arrived back home, we heard a large amount of commotion in the corridor. Out of interest, we went outside. There were police everywhere. We managed to ask one of the officers what was going on. Apparently, an old lady had passed away. She had not given the building a spare key to her apartment, so the officers had to break in. And these doors here were real deal fireproof, 2-inch thick mechanisms with 3 locks. The amount of damage they had to give that poor door before it gave the slightest bit of entry was unbelievable. At this time, I felt bad for the old lady and soon forgot all about it. Around 2 months later, that nasty smell started to come back. My dad told me that somebody had probably gone on vacation but accidentally left their garbage. This smell seemed to be the strongest next to the door across from us. It got to a point where it became hard to breathe. Somebody complained and the authorities were called. Inside the apartment, they found the remains of a young female in an advanced stage of decomposition, with an infestation of ants and maggots living off of her. Apparently, she had popped when they were trying to transport her, launching maggots and ants everywhere. I later learned that she experienced a very slow and painful demise. She had constantly been eating a food that was actually poisoning her. She had passed away in her bedroom, which shared a wall with mine. Ever since then, until we moved, we suffered a small ant infestation. It scares me to this day that the ants that climbed on my bed were the same ones who climbed all over and feasted upon that woman. I don't know if it was a coincidence that those two people passed at the same time almost, on the same floor in the same building, and yet they had partially decomposed before anyone had found them. Backyard Camping from Michael 131. I don't remember how old I was. I believe I was 7 years old. We had just moved in next door to my neighbor, whom we've known for about 15 years and was basically family. It was the 4th of July. I just got back from Wyoming. We had asked our neighbor if we could gather a bunch of our friends and camp in her backyard. She said yes, so we set up some tents and watched the fireworks before heading to our tents for the night. Sometime during the night, my sister had gotten up to go to the bathroom. She soon came back, seemingly uneventful. Later that evening, we heard huffing noises outside the tent. Mind you, bears around our parts in a rural village in Ohio. We don't have a dense enough forest to house bears. Usually it's just coyotes and deer and smaller predators. But it was a full moon, so we could see pretty well. Just outside the tents, it was a well-lit field. Keep this in mind, the footsteps and huffing noises kept circling the tents, and everyone heard it. As it approached my tent, I made out the unmistakable figure of a bear, seemingly searching for food or other scavengeable products. All of us were unarmed, as the massive creature began to paw and bite at the tent, easily creating ribbons out of the tent nylon. I'm not sure if it knew I was inside the tent, but it definitely wanted inside. Suddenly, one of my friends screamed, and the thing bounded away before it could get all the way in. This was terrifying. Imagine growing up in an area where bears don't exist, only to wake up in the middle of the night in a tent as one begins to chew through the wall. I'm so glad it was able to be scared away. Apparently, it wasn't that hungry. If you're wondering where the bear came from, it was apparently an escaped bear from a local zoo, and it just happened to come our way. It circled my tent all night. From James's call. Location unknown. It was the early 1980s, and my dad and uncle both bought a summer home in the countryside, which had some beautiful dense woods behind it. We would often go there over the summer and enjoy the serenity of nature away from the city. At that time, my cousin and I would hang out a lot together, and we spent many hours hiking deep into those woods behind the house. And being independent kids, we decided to take my dad's camping equipment and set up an overnight campsite about 100 feet away from the house. We did this every day, and it became the thing we did every summer. Our parents were always nearby in the house, and always kept their windows open where they could easily see and hear us. They were totally okay with us being alone in the woods at night, and sometimes even pushed us to spend more time out there, even when we didn't feel like it. It became our favorite getaway from the city, and each summer, we really looked forward to going. It was one particular summer. We weren't going to go because my uncle had to go out of state, but I had been waiting all year to go, and I was devastated after hearing that we wouldn't be going after all. It meant that I'd have to go to day camp with all those annoying kids from school, and they didn't treat me too kindly. Being a 5-hour drive north, my parents weren't going to make such a trip without my uncle and his family, so the answer was no and no. I never was a nagging child, and often tried to help out when I could. But that summer, oh, you bet I acted up. I made the summer pretty difficult whenever I could, and always mentioned to them how they could make it better for me. I didn't want to wait another whole year, and I tried my best to convince them with whatever tactic I thought would work. To my surprise, my constant nagging seemed to have worked on them, because one day, they finally gave in. I later realized that it was probably because a family friend decided to come along with us and make the trip worth our while. Anyway, we traveled together for 5 straight hours and finally reached our destination. I could smell that pine wood scent again, and I got ready to build my campsite. It took a little longer than usual because I was alone, but I got it all set up nice and dandy. I'd gone camping enough times before with my cousin, and I felt more than confident to be alone in the dark. Although I did decide to set up my tent a bit closer to the house, just in case. The sun began to set, and I glanced at my watch. It was 8:35 p.m. There was this unusual quietness that made me a bit anxious. But I was usually chatting with my cousin, and just thought I never noticed it, not until now. Part of our camping experience was reading science fiction novels until we got tired and fell asleep, and for that night, I brought an exciting new book I'd wanted to read for some time. Flashlight in one hand and book in the other, I began to read. This flashlight was one of those heavy metal ones that often flickered out. I'd have to hit it a couple of times and that would usually do the trick. It must have been around 4 a.m. when I was suddenly awakened by the sound of something brushing against my tent. At first, I wasn't sure if I had just imagined it or not, or if it was some rabbit that had passed by, but I quietly sat up for a moment and listened to my surroundings. There were no sounds and nothing special to hear, so I assumed it was just a small animal, and I tried to fall back to sleep. A few minutes passed by, and I was about to doze off, when something about 40 feet away from me made this freakishly angry feline growl that turned into what sounded like a woman with an old, hoarse voice. A cold shiver suddenly ran down my spine, and my thoughts began to race through my head as I imagined what it could be. It sounded human, but it also sounded like an animal. I thought of yelling for my mom and dad, but I was way too scared to even make a sound. I reached for my flashlight, and I turned it on. But instantly I realized the mistake I had made, as the growl suddenly became quiet. I quickly shut off the light, and I hid under my sleeping bag, hoping that it did not hear me, or that it had not seen my light. To my horror, it slowly approached and stopped right outside my tent. For a while, I just stood there, breathing loudly, and each breath sounded raspy and was full of moist pops and clicks, like its throat was filled with far too much saliva. I thought maybe it would go away if I just waited, but several more minutes passed, and the thing did not move. I could hear its head moving back and forth like it was trying to find me or sense where I was, but I didn't dare let out a breath or move a muscle. Every so often it would scratch the wall of the tent, like it was testing the walls, thinking about coming inside. But I prayed and prayed that it didn't. I waited, every single minute feeling like an entire hour. It kept circling me, walking and rubbing itself against the tent all night, trying to find a way to get into me, but it luckily never did. It wasn't until dawn broke, when the sun started to come up, that I finally heard it scurry away, and I no longer heard it. When my parents found me, they said that I was white like snow and they couldn't move. I was in such a state of shock that they rushed me to the hospital right away, and I stayed there for a couple of days. I only recovered a few months later, but I still get chills every time I share this story with people. I never went camping for many years after that, but I eventually did start camping again with a few buddies of mine over the years. I never did go back in the woods alone. My dad eventually sold the house to some couple who lives there to this very day, and I never experienced anything like it since. What it could have been, I can't tell you. Maybe it was just some crazy old woman, or maybe it really was a monster. The Little Girl, from Bergherder. I was visiting some of my girlfriend's friends in her hometown of Rock Creek, British Columbia, Canada. It's one of those kinds of towns that has a gas station, a restaurant and a bar, and a couple of local shops. Very little there. Her family owns an acreage there consisting of a long driveway, a kinda run-down house, a shop, and a small animal enclosure with barns. It was summer and gets very warm that time of year in the area, so we decided to set up a tent on the deck of the shop and sleep outside. The shop is 2 stories, so the deck is fairly high up. We spent the day with her friend. It was getting late, so we decided to go set up our makeshift camp. Her friend said she may come by at some point and hang out later, so off we went back to the property. When we got there, it was a bit windy, but it was a clear summer night. We set up a propane fire pit and just hung out for a bit. It got dark and we were tired from traveling that day, so we went to bed, figuring her friend decided not to come. This is when things got weird. Not more than 10 minutes after being in bed, we heard a girl laughing in the distance. It was close enough it sounded like it was from the driveway area. We assumed her friend came up after all, so we crawled out of our tents and set up the chairs again. We waited, and no one came around. We chalked it up to the wind. We get back into bed, and not more than 10 minutes goes by before we hear it again. This girl laughing sounded closer this time, but now we were creeped out, so we didn't want to investigate. I know most people want the juicy tale of some grotesque sight, but screw that, I was not going out there. After the second time, we didn't hear it again, and we eventually fell asleep, still blaming the wind. The following day, we mentioned the story to her dad. He told us a tale about some years back before he bought the farm in the 70s. There was a family that lived there, a man, his wife, and daughter. The daughter was apparently killed in a farming accident. She was backed over by a tractor. I've been to the property since, but I'll never go back at night. After hearing that story, I'm glad I stayed in the tent.